Hello again. This session, Financial Compensation for Ministers and Other Budgeting Issues, would probably be the very best if we were in a group together in a room where we could dialogue and ask questions and different things. That was the original idea. But as many things this year, this past 10 months, things have changed. And so we're going to try to adapt this to a presentation, but at the end I'll give you a phone number and email address, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate. The purpose of this session is to help the local church deal with their finances. First and foremost, it is important to discuss the compensation for the pastor. That's what we want to get to, and I'm sure that you have heard more than once. The Bible talks about money more than most people like to admit. And it's no wonder, because Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This session is designed to help the church think about the budgeting process and how taking care of the pastor is significant to the church. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, suppose you want to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Well, this statement is a follow-up to Jesus' declaration of the cost of becoming a disciple. Discipleship, or becoming a follower of Christ, is not just a casual choice to go to church, but it is a radical decision to know Christ, to sit at His feet, and to follow in His footsteps. Learning what it means to love God with our whole heart and to love others, our neighbors, our family, and even our enemies. Discipleship includes our stewardship of the resources that God provides for us. Every local church should have a budget, a detailed plan of the projection of how much you're going to spend. Oh, well, let's backtrack for a moment. To fail to plan is a plan to fail. Did you catch that? To fail to plan is a plan to fail. And so here we are today talking a little bit about how the local church needs to spend time in the budgeting process. And there are two particular aspects of the budget. What is our income going to be? Let me backtrack. I'm pushing too many buttons too fast. What is our income going to be, and how much are we going to spend? Those are the questions you have to ask as you begin this process. Particularly when we get towards the end of the session, we're going to talk about the pastor's compensation. It's vitally important that you have begun the budgeting process and you have answered these two questions. It's part of the process. So let's look at projecting income. Now, you may have your own method of projecting your income for your local church. And if you have one and it's been working, by all means, continue that process. You don't need to try to create something new if it's working. But this is a method that I used in our local church when we were in the process of trying to plan a budget. I've taken some figures from one of our churches on our district just to kind of help us. And you can see their total income for the last 5 years. 2015 through 16, it was $50,000. And last year, $58,650. So for me, as I began to do this budgeting process, what I would do was add these 5 years together and then divide by 5, and you get a number of $56,640.40. That could be one of the ways that you start the budgeting process. This is your projected income. Now let me just say to you, as I look at this, I see already that the $56,000 is less than what you've raised the last 3 years. So I think that probably you want to project a budget greater than $56,000. But this is just one of the methods. We can look at another and see, oops, I made it a little too big there in that process. But you can notice there on 2021, the first 6 months of the year, this church raised $39,000. You double that and you get $79,600. Now, wow, that is a huge increase over 2019, 2020. And you probably need to look at what happened during this year that in the first 6 months that we raised so much more money than we had raised in the past. But you could just figure out, project what you're going to raise in 2021, insert that figure even though you're not there yet, the end of the year hasn't come, and you could come up with $62,400.60 and use that as your projected income for the year. The point being that it really doesn't matter what method you use, but you have some method that you use to project the income for your local church. Now, some of you have already perfected this. You have found a way that in your local church you can know you can do your very best to come very close to guesstimating what you're going to raise in the year ahead. Now, sometimes we have pandemics that change drastically, and so for some of you this year you've had to go back and readjust your budget because you haven't been bringing in what you had expected. I know that in our 6-month reports from the churches across the district, there were a few churches that actually showed increases. In fact, this church that I just gave you their numbers, they had shown an increase over the year before. But some of you are down over 30%. And so you've had to adjust your expenses because your income is not what you expected it to be. So project your income and then begin to project your expenses. Here are just a few of the items that I think that every church needs to begin to look at. There may be some others. You look at your expenditures, your budgets, and you see what you need, but here's several of them that I think are vitally important. Tithe. Oh yes, a local church needs to tithe. It's part of the biblical principles that we believe and we teach to our people in their individual incomes. And so why would we not consider that to be part of the process of the local church? Now you see that our tithe, our budget allocations on our district, they actually total up, they're better than 10%. They're 15.585%. And I would encourage you to work and strive towards that. But at the bare minimum, budget, tithe 10% to give to others, to these budget allocations, to be a part of the bigger picture of the denomination. Secondly, you have salaries. Now, I will tell you that most of our research shows that salaries range in the area between 40 and 60% of your income. So when we get down to figuring the expenses, you can look back at your income and see if your salaries fit in that 40 to 60%. Building cost. As you look at building costs, you have this idea of your mortgages, of upkeep and repair, all those kind of things. Utilities. You have your utilities. Now, does that include the parsonage utilities if you have a parsonage, or do you have another mechanism? Insurance, vitally important. Every church needs to evaluate their insurance at least every 3 years, but I would suggest every year you sit down with an agent and you take time to make sure that you are covered in the life of your church. Then you have your ministry programs. What are you spending in children's ministry and youth ministry and music ministry, other areas of outreach? How are you investing your funds? How do you expect to spend your money to reach out into the midst of your community? Compassion. I think every church needs to be involved in some sort of compassionate ministry, compassionate giving. I know in one of the churches I pastored, we made a decision that 10% of our leftover would always go into a separate fund that was just to give away to people in need. So if we had $3,000 left at the end of the month that we didn't spend, $300 of that went over into a separate savings account that was designed just to help. Plus we budgeted money for that as well. And then the final item on this list, I think that most churches ignore this, but I think it's very important. You need to consider setting some money aside. Savings. The year of the pandemic, 2020, if you had a reduction of 30% in your income for the year, how are you going to survive? Well, if you made a plan to budget for savings, you would have a little bit of help there. So now let's talk a little bit about the pastoral compensation element of that package, of that budgeting process. You need to know that a minister is a very unique tax situation. It's just an interesting process, and so work closely with your pastors to help come up with a system that gives them the best tax situation possible. If you aren't aware of taxes very much, and even pastors, if you don't know much about how to allot your salary in such a way, find someone that does. We'll talk a little bit about that today. There I mentioned a bit ago, 40 to 60% of your income should go towards your pastor's compensation. If you have multiple staff, that would be included in that as well. Looking back at the budget that we presented in terms of projecting the income, you can see that the pastor's salary, pastor's compensation will end up being somewhere, should be around between $23,000 and $35,000. In this particular case, this church provides a parsonage. That's not included in that. So you need to work on that. In addition, you also need to know that the district has a policy that the district assembly has adopted. It's an important part of the process. I've had to talk with church boards about this an awful lot as we look at making pastoral changes. From the district's perspective, if you expect to have a full-time pastor, the district policy simply says to be full-time, you must pay a minimum of $500 a week cash, provide a parsonage or comparable parsonage allowance, and fully reimburse their Social Security. If you don't do that, then you are expecting to have a part-time pastor. And several of our churches do that, and it works well. So bivocational pastoral ministry is not a problem. But some of our churches think that they want a full-time pastor, but they're not willing to pay. So the district has established a policy in that process. If you're not meeting that minimum, then you need to expect a part-time pastor. Let me just say in that as well, when you expect a bivocational pastor, one of the things that you might begin to think about, is there an area church close to me that they can't afford a full-time pastor either? And so the two of you could kind of each provide a bivocational job for that. It would be much better than the person having to get a job outside of the church world and have a time clock that they have to clock in and out on. Whereas if they were working for two churches, the time frame would be flexible and you could spend some time. So if you're in that situation, it may be that you want to think about trying to establish a circuit that we put pastors on so that they can do that. Here is a statement that's in our policy. The church review the ministerial staff's salary at least annually, and that increases reflect at least the cost of living increases. We maybe could have worded that better. I copied that directly out of that, but basically, church boards, financial people, you need to be evaluating your pastoral salary annually. And you need to do your very best to trust God to provide for a minimum of a cost of living increase. I did just a little bit of research. So if you haven't changed your pastor's salary in the last 5 years, so say he was getting $500 a week, and you haven't changed that over the last 5 years, that's what you're still getting, he or she is still getting, the cost of living has increased a minimum of 8% over those last 5 years. So if you have not increased their salary, they have actually taken a deduction in their wages, in their compensation. So we encourage you, we direct you, it is policy that you review your staff salary, and then it even talks about that you communicate that with me, the district superintendent, that you have evaluated it and what decisions you've made. Sometimes there are years that you can't increase that. I understand that. I remember that as a pastor. But we do ask that you communicate with the pastor, with the district superintendent, that you have evaluated their salaries and that you have at least looked at it. For the pastor's salary, there are two options to assist in reducing tax liability: professional car allowance / reimbursement and car allowance reimbursement. What that simply means is that there is a way that you can establish reimbursements that are not taxable income. Go back to the $500 a week figure. If you don't reimburse all of your professional expenses for your pastor, you can allow them to establish a fund as a part of their package and divide it up in such a way that it could be given to them in response to expenses that they have that's not reimbursed by the church. It reduces the $500 a week. It reduces the tax liability of the $500 a week, but you're still giving them $500 a week. It's just in the way that you break it down. So professional allowance reimbursement. These are the items that a pastor spends because he or she is a minister, but they are not established as a separate reimbursement item. Therefore, it can come out of the weekly salary and be labeled professional allowance. Two important things. Number one, it must be established at the beginning of the year. You must do that in January. Better yet, do it in December of the last year for the next year. It must be in your minutes. It must be part of the working of the church board that you established, that those items that the pastor spends because he or she is a minister, but you don't reimburse him for them, you can take that out of their salary and give that to them. Again, this is really designed to make sure that we have interaction and conversation, to make sure that it's being clearly articulated. But it must be established at the beginning of the year, and then also you must turn in receipts. Pastors, you have to turn in the receipts to get reimbursed for those money, for your allowances. You can't just say, well, I'm going to take $30 a week and then you spend that however. You've got to turn in those receipts. For me, I always did it on a monthly basis, and they reimbursed me for those professional allowances on a monthly basis according to the receipts that I turned in. So professional allowance, car allowance. These are the miles that a pastor drives because he or she is a minister, but they are not established as a separate reimbursement item. Therefore, it can come out of the weekly salary and be labeled a car allowance. Now, you may say to your pastor, we're going to reimburse you for your trip to district assembly. So they're going to travel 300 miles round trip, and you're going to give them a separate check for that. That's not part of their compensation. But maybe you don't reimburse them for their miles around town, their miles to visit you, to make home visits or drive to the community hospital. But if the pastor determines that they have a car allowance need, that they're going to drive some around the community that's not reimbursed by the church as part of a separate line item, you can reduce their salary, reduce their tax liability by establishing a car allowance. Two things: it must be established at the beginning of the year, better yet in December, and you must turn in a mileage log to your church treasurer, to your church financial secretary, whoever is tracking that, and be reimbursed at the IRS rate. So pastor, You want to guesstimate how many miles you're going to travel each month and use that to establish your car allowance. Again, we really need the dialogue, so if you have questions, please contact me and we'll give you that information. One final thing is the housing allowance. If you provide a parsonage for them, you still can provide a housing allowance for the pastor, and that reduces their tax liability. Things that they can include in their housing allowance would be furniture. They're going to buy a new living room set, a new couch, and a couple recliners. Well, because they invite people into their home, it can be counted as housing allowance. Cleaning supplies, decorations, those kind of things can be part of the housing allowance. It too must be established at the beginning of the calendar year, but it's not taxable income in terms of income tax. It is figured on your housing allowance, line 14 of your W-2, and you will pay Social Security on that. But those are three different ways that you can adjust the pastoral compensation. You still pay them $500 a week or whatever it is that you're established, but it adjusts their tax liability. So hopefully that's been a little helpful in the process. And here's just a couple of other ideas or other thoughts to give you as we kind of wrap this up. You need to know every pastor should receive a W-2 from the church. They are not a 1099 employee or contractor. I know that according to Uncle Sam, you label us as self-employed, but the truth of the matter is it has to be on a W-2 form from the church. And every church, you should be filing that with the government and giving that to your pastor. Then there's a lot of questions raised about, is it better to have a parsonage or a housing allowance? Well, there are so many different factors in that, and we can't discuss all of those here in this session today. But if you are considering that, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to some other pastors, and let's talk about the value of housing allowance, the value of a parsonage, and different things like that. Thirdly, I want to encourage you to contribute to a pastor's retirement fund. One of the things that you can do is challenge the pastor to match the church's contribution, or really the other way around. You as a church will match the pastor's contribution. This is an important part. Retirement in the Church of the Nazarene is not necessarily just the best case scenario. And churches, do your very best to help encourage your pastor to plan for their future. And pastor, you can also reduce your tax liability by taking some of your salary and investing it into your retirement fund. So I encourage you to consider those things. And here today, again, here's my email address, terry@illininaz.org, or my number, 405-202-0346. And we have hurriedly run through just a whole bunch of material. I'm sure it's as if the fire hydrant has been opened and it's just overwhelmed you. But this is a good starting point for your conversations about your budget, about caring for your pastor. In your budgeting, project your income, project your expenses. Make sure that you are not planning to spend more money than you take in. And then plan to take care of your pastor, your ministerial staff, in a way that's pleasing to God. And always, if you ever err, always err on the side of generosity. Thanks for the time. Wasn't a very lengthy time, but it's incredible information that we need to be aware of. Have a great day.